The nervous system is about sending messages from the brain to every living cell in the body. We have motor nerves and we have sensory nerves in the body, and the sensory nerves are the ones that pick up the messages, pick up the signals and send them to the brain, and then it's the motor nerves that take the actions from the brain down to the muscles to perform an action, to respond to that sensory impulse. So we're going to be looking at covering the communication network for the whole body and learning about how the body informs and warns the rest of the body about different environmental changes, pain, danger, and making sure that we understand how these messages are sent, received and processed by the brain and different nerves in the body. We also need to look at the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord, and the spinal cord travels down through the spine vertebrae which protects them. We also need to look at the peripheral nervous system, which consists of the cranial, spinal nerves and the autonomic system. So we're going to have an overview of the nervous system, what a neuron looks like, what the neuroglia is like, how the messages are sent through the body, how is the brain made up, what happens in different parts of the brain, and then we're going to look at some of the diseases. So a good all-round knowledge of the nervous system. So to recap on the nerve tissue and the nerve cells, the neurons are the name of the nerve cells and neuroglia is the name of the connective tissue that we have for the nerves, but it doesn't transmit any nerve impulses. This is a network of branched cells and fibres which helps to support and sustain the neurons. So you need to know that a nerve cell is called a neuron and nerve tissue is called neuroglia. A neuron also has a nucleus and cytoplasm and a membrane, and it's long and narrow, and some of them can be up to 1 metre long. They are often damaged by toxins and lack of oxygen, and this is the only cell in the body that doesn't actually replace itself with mitosis. It can regenerate, so if it's damaged, it can regenerate itself, but sometimes it can be damaged irreparably. But quite often you might find if you cut your finger, at the tip of the finger, it might be a bit numb after you've damaged it. But later on you might find a month or even a year sometimes, you'll suddenly feel, oh no, I've got the feeling back in that finger. So the nerves do replenish themselves. The nerve impulse is collected by the dendrites that you see on the left of the picture that are sticking out from the cell body. And the impulse travels then from the dendrites to the cell body through the axon and exits at the synapse. It leaps over a gap between that and the next neuron onto the dendrites of the next neuron. So the impulse always travels in one direction. It's always from the dendrites through the cell body, down through the axon and out at the synapse. So only in one direction do the nerve impulses travel. The neuron, like any cell, is made up of organelles, baby organs. And the cell body, the other name of the cell body is soma. In the centre of the cell body we have a nucleus, and this is surrounded by a jelly-like substance called cytoplasm. If you remember, cytoplasm is the name given for the jelly-like substance which goes from the outside of the cell membrane through to the nucleus in the centre. The plasm in the nucleus is called nucleoplasm. And in this cytoplasm, sticking out from the cytoplasm, we have our dendrites. And these are receiving fibres, there's many branches of them, and they collect the impulses or signals that are picked up on these hair-like structures and transmitted to the cell body. And this can happen at 290 kilometres per hour. It's very, very fast. The blink of an eye. Really, really quick. So the neuron organelles, we're going to go through these. And this first one is the cell body, also known as the soma, which has the dendrites on it, which are hair-like structures that receive the impulses and send the messages at 290 kilometres an hour up through the cell. So the dendrites are the little fibres that pick up the nerve signals and transfer it through to the cell body or soma. And then the signal gets transferred to the axon. And the axon is a single nerve fibre which transmits the nerves away from the cell body. It's made of white matter and it's covered by a white fatty substance called the myelin sheath, which insulates it and covers and protects the axon. It also, this fatty substance, speeds up the conduction of the nerve, so increases the speed of the nerve as it travels through the axon. And people who have problems with the myelin sheath suffer from MS, which MS also stands for myelin sheath. So multiple sclerosis, MS is also a problem with the myelin sheath. They have slow responses to nerve impulses. So the axon is a single nerve fibre which transmits impulses, made of white matter, covered with a myelin sheath which speeds up the conduction of the nerve and protects, covers and insulates the axon. A neurolemma is a fine, delicate membrane within the axon, and it's within the peripheral nerves but not in the brain or the spinal cord, and this helps to regenerate cells. This is one of the reasons why the nerves over a period of time might come back with feeling in the peripheral nerves but not in the brain or the spinal cord. So if you damage the spinal cord, it is permanent, and if you have nerve damage in the brain, that's permanent as well. The nodes of Ranvier are a little compressed point or a little dimple in the myelin sheath, and this also increases the speed of the nerve impulses throughout the nerve fibre and also helps to provide nutrients to the axon. The axon terminals are also known as end feet, and these are made of tiny little fibrils, and they pass the impulses over to the next nerve and the dendrites on the next nerve. The synapse is not actually a physical thing. It's a gap between one nerve and another. The nerves never meet, but the nerve impulses travel from one end of the nerve to the other, always in one direction. And then they leap from the axon terminals, from those end feet fibrils, across the gap to the dendrites of the next nerve. So the gap never meets one another. The gap is known as the synapse, and there's no physical contact between it, and the leap is made by a chemical messenger which is known as a neurotransmitter. This takes the impulse across the gap to the next nerve. And the nerve impulses, as I said, all travel in one direction. The nerve impulses travel from the dendrites to the cell body, through the axon to the end feet, where the neurotransmitters then carried across to the synapse of the next dendrite. The impulse, which is the response to the stimuli, and that could be anything like a temperature, pressure, a chemical response, and the impulses are caused by a chemical compound. So when the inside of the cell, the potassium ions are positively charged, and outside of the cell, the sodium ions are positively charged, the membrane, which is potassium permeable, this results in the membrane changing to be sodium permeable so that the sodium can rush into the cell.
leaving the outside of the cell negatively charged. This is called reverse polarity. And the reaction is, it causes a reaction on the next part of the cell, and the cycle starts all over again. Now, this is quite a complicated process, this chemical exchange, and it's to do with sodium particles and potassium particles and positive and negative energy. Now, I've included a clip further on which will explain this, I hope, in a little bit more detail. But we have never had a question about the sodium and potassium ions and whether they're positive or negatively charged, because it is quite a complicated process. Now, a reflex arc is an automatic movement. It's not controlled by the brain, but it's an automatic movement to a stimulus, and this is instant and involuntary. There are times when we will suddenly pick up a sense which is life-threatening or could be potentially dangerous. For instance, if I was to put my finger onto a hot stove and the skin nerve endings, the sensory nerves, picked up that it was really hot, I wouldn't want for that message to have to wait for the brain to interpret it in order to get the motor nerves to move my finger out of the way. So a reflex arc involves the sense organs. So it could be the skin, could be an organ, a tendon or a muscle. And the sensory nerves, which are peripheral nerves, and the spinal cord, which send the message then to the motor nerve from the spinal cord to that periphery organ, so that it's an immediate, quick response, so that we don't have to wait for the brain to interpret it. It's an unsupervised response. So, for instance, if you eat something poisonous, the stomach might suddenly decide that you're going to vomit it up as an immediate reaction, rather than waiting for the brain to pick up a sensory response and for it to act in its own time to have a motor reaction, which would be to vomit up the food. So a reflex arc is an automatic movement in response to a stimulus which does not involve the brain. It goes to the spinal cord and gets sent straight down a motor nerve as well. So it doesn't involve the brain for interpretation. So you need to know the types of nerves that we have and the different matter that is made up of different parts of the nervous system. So we have sensory and motor nerves, and sometimes we have mixed nerves that have both. But generally a nerve is either a sensory or a motor nerve. Now, a sensory nerve is also what they call an afferent nerve. And an afferent nerve is a nerve that arrives at the brain. So if you think of the A's, A comes before E, afferent comes before efferent, and the sensory nerves are all afferent nerves. They pick up the impulses and they take them to the brain. So they arrive at the brain. And sensory nerves carry impulses related to feelings, tastes, hearing, and they're mainly in the ganglia. They're mainly part of ganglia. The motor or efferent nerves exit the brain, and they bring about an action, and you'll find them mainly in the brain. Whereas mixed nerves carry both, and they're only found in the spine. And they measure and stretch like the muscles in the bladder wall, for instance. Then we have white and grey matter, and you need to know where these are found. And the white matter is found inside the brain, but outside the spine. And in this white matter, you have lots of bundles of myelin nerves. The grey matter is outside the brain and inside the spinal cord. And this is found in cell bodies and in unmyelinated nerves. So the brain is situated in the head and is protected inside the cranium. The cranium is the top part of the skull. The brain is the control centre of the whole body and is divided into 4 ventricles, which we can see quite clearly in the picture that you have in your handout in different colours. Now, these 4 ventricles contain cerebrospinal fluid, and the ventricles are holes or spaces which are there to protect the brain. Anywhere that there's holes and spaces in the body are there for protection, a little bit like bubble wrap and the holes we get in bubble wrap. Now, we have 3 layers to the brain, and they're called meninges, and these are generally for protection. We have the dura mater, which is the outer membrane, the arachnoid mater, which is the middle, and the pia mater, which is the inner. The dura mater is very durable. It's tough, fibrous, surrounds the skull, the spinal cord, and it's covered with periosteum. Do you remember periosteum is a white protective covering on bone? So the dura mater is the outer layer of the brain, which is tough, fibrous tissue, surrounds the skull, the spinal cord, and also periosteum, and it's durable. It adheres to the lining of the skull and the vertebrae, and it continues through the spinal cord as spinal dura. The arachnoid mater is the middle layer, and this looks like a spider's web. That's where it gets its name, and it's made of delicate serous membrane. The pia mater is the inner layer, and this is a fine vasculous layer following closely the contours of the brain and the spinal cord, and has a network of capillaries which provides the brain surface and the spinal cord with blood. The brain is divided into 3 different parts. We have the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brain stem. And we're going to go on to talk about those in a bit more detail. So we're going to talk about the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain and divided into 2 parts, the right and left hemispheres. The outer layer is made of grey matter, and these folds increase the surface area. The inside are nerve fibres and white matter, and it's the fibres that connect the different parts of the brain. Now, the cerebrum is also divided. It's not in your syllabus, but it makes it more understandable if you understand that the cerebrum is divided into 4 lobes, and these are known as the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And you might have noticed that they actually correlate with the names of the bones that you have on the skull. It's in these lobes where the functions of the cerebrum occur. And the frontal lobe is responsible for lots of different functions, for our reasoning, for planning, for our speech, for the emotions, to a certain degree for movement and for problem solving. So the frontal lobe is reasoning, planning, speech, emotions, movements, problem solving. Whereas the parietal lobes, these are either side of the top, this is responsible for movement as well, orientation, recognition, and perception. The temporal lobe, as we might expect, is responsible for auditory perception, for memory, and for speech. And the occipital lobe at the back of the head is for visual processing. What's interesting about this is my father, towards the end of his life, suffered lots of mini strokes and TIAs, and as a result of one of his mini strokes, he had damage to the occipital lobe, and this interfered with his visual processing, especially when it came to looking at a clock and reading the time. He could see the clock, he could see where the arrows were pointing, but he couldn't actually perceive or process what he was visually seeing. It was the same with the speedometer in a car. He no longer was safe to drive because although he could see the speedometer and he could see that the arrow was pointing at 30 miles an hour, 40 miles an hour, he couldn't process what he was visually seeing. So it's quite interesting that these different lobes are responsible for different functions, and damage to those lobes will affect certain areas of our function as well. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It's divided into two parts, the right and left hemispheres, and it's divided into these four lobes, which are responsible for a lot of mental activity, memory, intelligence, reasoning, conscious perceptions, heat, pain, cold, sensory perception, sight, hearing, smell and touch, and the initiation of voluntary movement, that we choose to make. So this all happens in these four lobes. But in particular, the frontal lobe is very responsible for reasoning, planning, for speech, emotions, movements, problem solving. The parietal is responsible for movement as well, but also for orientation and recognition and perception. The temporal is responsible for auditory as well as sight, hearing, smell and touch, and perception, memory and speech. And the occipital is responsible for visual processing. The cerebellum is about the size of an egg. It's known as the small brain, and its cerebellum is Latin for little brain. It sits in the posterior cranial fossa. So in the cranium we have a little indentation. A fossa is a sort of indentation, and the cerebellum sits in this little indentation in the cranium, below the cerebrum, but behind what we call the pons viroli, and over the medulla oblongata. It's got two hemispheres, and the grey matter is outside and the white matter is inside. And the function of the cerebellum is to coordinate muscle movement, make sure our movements are smooth, precise and accurate, making sure that we have good balance and equilibrium, and making sure that subconsciously, we still have muscle tone and posture. I try and remember that the cerebellum is the small one because it's like a baby bell. Cerebellum reminds me of a baby bell, which is a small brain and is responsible for the muscle movements, smooth, precise, accurate movements, our balance, equilibrium, muscle tone and posture. The brain stem is situated where the spinal cord enters the brain, so it's at the back of the neck really. It's divided up into the midbrain, the pons viroli and the medulla oblongata. And the midbrain sits between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, but above the pons viroli. Now the nerve cells and fibres transmit messages. It's like a relay station for neuro messages to pass through the brain. It transmits messages from the cerebrum, the cerebellum and the spinal cord. And its job is to help with vision, with hearing, with eye and body movements. Whereas the pons viroli, this is like a bridge or a gap between the cerebellum hemispheres. And the pons viroli is responsible for the motor sensor and the sensory analysis. So it's the motor nerves and the sensory nerves pass through this, and it interprets the motor center and the sensory analysis. Whereas the medulla oblongata is the lowest part of the brain stem, And this is slightly different in structure. It's got white matter outside and grey matter inside. But it has a very important role, and the role of the medulla oblongata is to control vital functions. These are obligatory functions. So think of the oblongata being obligatory. If these vital functions don't take place, then we would die. So we are obliged to breathe, and we're obliged to have our heart working. So the medulla oblongata controls the cardiac centre, the respiratory centre, as well as the reflex centre. So everything that we need for survival, really, controls the breathing rate and the heart rate, all the things that are obliged to do to keep us alive. So the cardiac centre controls the rate and force of the heart. The respiratory centre controls the rate and depth of breathing. It also controls the vasomotor centre. Now, this is about the dilation and contraction of blood vessels. And the reflex centre that's within the medulla oblongata also controls how we respond to irritants. So, with example, vomiting, sneezing, swallowing are all irritants in the body that the reflex centre responds to. So that's your brain stem. You've got the midbrain, the pons varoli, and the medulla oblongata. The spinal cord is the part of the nervous system, the central nervous system, that extends from the medulla oblongata, and it goes all the way down the spine and finishes at the first lumbar vertebrae. There are 31 spinal nerves and 1 cranial nerve, so do try and remember that. It is often an ITEC question. And the spinal cord consists of white matter on the outside and grey matter on the inside. And the function of the spinal cord is to contain and to protect the motor and sensory nerves that travel from the medulla oblongata all the way down the spine, and at the same time allow those messages to go to and from the body to the brain. The messages from the body go up the sensory nerves to the brain for interpretation, and then back down the motor nerves in order to form an action or to make something happen. So that's your spinal cord. Cerebrospinal fluid is a clear, colourless fluid that protects the brain and the spinal cord. The brain floats in cerebrospinal fluid within the brain. It's produced in 4 of the cavities. These cavities within the brain are called hemispheres and ventricles. So it's stored and circulated in the meninges. So the cerebrospinal fluid is like engine oil. It lubricates everything. And because the brain is protected by the skull, this floats also in the cerebrospinal fluid, is going to help the equilibrium of the brain. The consistency of engine oil, it contains proteins, nutrients, minerals, lymphocytes to help defend the brain from infection. So the function of this fluid is to keep the pressure stable and to make sure that the brain is constant and floating in this fluid and helping to protect that pressure and make it stable within the brain and the spinal cord, and to provide nutrients and removed waste from the brain and the spinal cord, to protect and to support and act as a shock absorber, and to maintain that uniform pressure so that the pressure doesn't vary. So that's the job of the cerebrospinal fluid. The hypothalamus can be found at the base of the midbrain and immediately above the pituitary gland. Its job is to regulate temperature in the body. So if you think of if you're suffering from hypothermia, try and remember that it's hypothalamus that regulates the temperature. It's also responsible for water balance in the body and our metabolism. It's the centre for our drives and our emotions. So thirst, appetite, sex, pain and pleasure all come from these drives of emotion in the hypothalamus. It's the conductor or the master gland of the endocrine system. So it conducts and regulates the pituitary gland. And it secretes two hormones called oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So it's the antidiuretic hormone that is responsible for balancing that fluid in the body. So it also regulates the autonomic nervous system, which is very important to us as well.
Initially, any sensory information that comes from the sensory nerves, like touch, cold, hot, what we feel, is interpreted by the thalamus. And it plays an important role in the regulating of sleep and wakefulness and how we feel during those states of sleep and wakefulness. So the thalamus is all about sensory nerve interpretation.
The peripheral nervous system controls the motor and the sensory nerves. So the peripheral nervous system tend to be in your extremities. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and these come down through the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the thoracic plexus, the lumbar plexus, the sacral plexus, and we have the coccygeal plexus. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. These are motor and sensory nerves. And then we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. And also in the peripheral nervous system, under this umbrella comes the autonomic nervous system as well. The spinal nerves are divided into plexus. These are groups supplying different areas of the body. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The cervical nerves have 8 pairs, the thoracic 12, the lumbar 5, the sacral 5, and the coccygeal 1 pair. So cervical have 8 pairs, thoracic has 12 pairs. Now these supply the chest muscles and the abdominal wall. The lumbar has 5 pairs, and these supply the skin and the muscles and the lower abdomen, the thighs and the groin. The sacrum has 5 pairs, and these supply the 4th and 5th lumbar, the 1 to 4 sacral, pelvis, hamstrings and femur. The coccygeal has 1 pair, and that's the back of the pelvis, the pelvic girdle, the anus and the genitals. Now, you might get asked how many nerves there are in what area, but I don't think you will be asked what they actually supply. This is for your interest and understanding. So the lumbar and the sacrum and the coccygeal leave the spinal cord at lumbar 1, so L1, and they form a bundle of nerves called the cauda equina. Now this is like a horse's tail. So we have had a question in the paper about cauda equina, and this is the term given to a bundle of nerves that are formed that provide the nervous responses for the lower part of the body, and it's known as horse's tail. The cervical plexus is the first 4 cervical nerves, and this supplies the neck muscles, the shoulders, the skin, the diaphragm. And brachial plexus are the second 4 cervical nerves and the first thoracic nerve, and this goes down into the arm. And the suppleness of the muscles and the supply of nerves to the muscles also comes out from this cervical plexus. So the skin from the base of the neck to the fingertips. So just a little bit more information on exactly what the spinal nerves do. And we have had questions about them. So the 31 pairs and the bunch that comes out from the first lumbar vertebrae that forms cauda equina is the horse's tail. The cranial nerves, 12 of them altogether, begin and end in the brain, so they only stay in the brain. They are motor, sensory, or sometimes they're mixed. They do both. Now, the first cranial nerve is the olfactory, and the olfactory is responsible for the sense of smell. Apparently, people who have problems with the brain and clots, potentially strokes in the brain, might well lose their sense of smell, I hear, before, as a sort of indicator that there might be something going on in the brain, which I think is quite interesting. The second cranial nerve is the optic nerve. Now, we go to an optician in order to check our vision and our sight. So an optic nerve is responsible for giving us our sight, our vision. Whereas the oculomotor nerve gives us eye movement. Oculo means eye, motor needs movement. The trochlea is a little bit more difficult. This moves the eye down and out. So down and out. So that's the trochlear nerve. Whereas the trigeminal nerve, this is the facial sensation. And it's quite often the one that's damaged if somebody suffers from Bell's palsy and has a drooping down one side of the face. The obducent or abducent eye is going to take the eye out laterally, so out to the side. The facial nerve gives us expression. The auditory nerve helps our hearing, and so the equilibrium in the body as well. The glossopharyngeal nerve gives us a sense of taste. Glossal is to do with tongue. So the glossopharyngeal is taste. The vagus nerve helps with monitoring the blood pressure, particularly in the aorta, and also helps with digestion. The accessory nerves control the trapezius, the sternocleidomastoid, and swallowing. So the accessory nerves are controlling the upper muscles of the trapezius, sternocleidomastoid, and also in swallowing. And the hypoglossal, now this helps with tongue movement. It's underneath the tongue, so it helps with the movement of the tongue. So they're the 12 cranial nerves. The olfactory system. The sense of smell and the odour molecules enter the nose, and the root of the nasal cavity is where the olfactory membrane is situated. And these are the smell sensing cells. They have ciliated epithelium, so they have hairs on them. They connect to the nerves in the olfactory plexus, and the olfactory nerves send messages along the olfactory tract to the brain. They interconnect with the medial temporal lobe, and particularly the limbic system, which also interprets smell. This is also linked to emotions, behaviour and memory. And this is where the sense of smell often will take us right back to a particular memory or particular time in our life, evoking quite strong emotions linked with that aroma, and maybe even reminding us of the behaviours and maybe changing the way we behave because of that provocative aroma. It also leads to the brain cortex, which is our conscious thought and taste information. So the information around the aroma gives us a sense of taste. The autonomic nervous system is made up of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And we do get quite a lot of questions in the exam about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic and which one decreases blood pressure and releases different neurotransmitters. So it's particularly the effect on the blood pressure with regard to the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic consists of a ganglia, and a ganglia is a collection of nerve cells situated in the front of the vertebral column and travels down the thoracic and the lumbar region. It stimulates and accelerates organs like the heart. So in sympathetic, it's funny because sympathy you would think would slow things down, but it doesn't. In this case, it stimulates and accelerates the organs of the heart. It releases noradrenaline, which accelerates, especially under stress. So it's a fight or flight. And in this fight or flight, we need to move. So if we're going to run, we need to have dilated blood vessels, dilated pupils. We need to increase the blood pressure, constricting the smaller arteries to the skin and constricting vessels to the digestive system, because we don't need to be digesting at the moment. So we restrict the flow of digestive juices. We need everything so that if we have to run, we are ready. This is a sustained contraction of the spleen, and it also increases circulation. So everything that happens is sympathetic to our fight or flight. So it's speeding everything up, stimulating, dilating, releasing, increasing, as opposed to the parasympathetic. Now, if you think if you're paralyzed, everything slows down to a stop. The parasympathetic consists of the vagus, the oculomotor, the facial nerve, the pharyngeal nerve, and the organs of the chest and the abdomen. So this slows down the action of these organs and slows down the action of the heart, releasing acetylcholine or choline, which is a neurotransmitter, and this decreases blood pressure and constricts the flow of the blood to the heart muscles. So it's everything. I'm parasympathetic, I'm relaxed, I'm calm, I'm slowing everything down. Whereas I'm sympathetic because I'm going to be fight or flight, everything's stimulated, adrenaline's going, rushing around the body, everything's increased, and that's your sympathetic nervous system. Neuritis is inflammation of a nerve, and you get pain along the root of the nerve, and sometimes the nerves go from the spinal cord around the body. You might get a loss of use, you might get, especially in areas supplied by that nerve, and its cause is either an injury or maybe an infection, or even poisons apparently can affect the action of a nerve. Bell's palsy is a type of facial paralysis. It quite often affects the trigeminal nerve or the facial nerve, and it's caused by an injury, an infection. George Clooney, in his teenage years, this is a picture of George, suffered from Bell's palsy. So it can affect anybody and everybody. Comes on very suddenly, but also can go away very suddenly as well. Neuralgia is pain along the course of one or more nerve. Sciatica is a form of neuralgia that shoots down the leg into the heel. There are many causes. The symptoms can include burning, stabbing, shooting pain, and a type of pain called allodynia. And allodynia is specific when you get pain on the skin or a nerve pain when you put clothes on to the skin. Putting clothes onto an area that has allodynia is really painful. Parkinson's disease, this is damage to the basal ganglia of the brain. This is a knot. A ganglia is a knot or a group, a network of nerves. There's a loss of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And in Parkinson's disease, symptoms include tremors, rigidity, slowness, difficulty with voluntary movements, sort of shuffling gait. That's Parkinson's disease. Epilepsy is somebody who has recurrent seizures or fits. It's caused by a sudden burst of excess electricity and which causes brain activity, resulting in temporary disruption to their normal messages in the brain, passing from one brain cell to another. The brain's messages halt and become mixed up, and this results in a fit. An epileptic will have two types of fits. There's a grand mal and there's a petit mal, for your interest. The grand mal is a big fit. A petit mal might even be a sort of vacant expression that nobody really notices. Multiple sclerosis, or MS, is also a sort of disseminating sclerosis. This is a loss of the myelin protection of the nerves in the central nervous system. Now, it's the myelin sheath, which also stands for MS, that is damaged or not working properly in the nerve, which causes MS. And as a result, the symptoms include muscle weakness, loss of coordination, maybe problems with the skin, the speech, and vision. So if you remember that MS, multiple sclerosis, affects the myelin sheath, the MS of the nerve, that's what causes multiple sclerosis. Myalgic encephalomyelitis is also known as ME. Post-viral fatigue is its other name, and it's difficult to diagnose because the symptoms vary so much, and they can include things like exhaustion, headache, aches and pains, dizziness. Motor neuron disease is a rare progressive disease that damages the nervous system, and the deterioration of the motor neurons, the structure and their function, mean that this is really quite debilitating. And we have Stephen Hawkins is a classic example of somebody who suffers from motor neuron disease. Alcohol abuse is about people who drink more than the recommended units a week and who have difficulty not drinking, and maybe drink at all times of the day, morning and night, and can't function without having a drink. The symptoms could be difficulty in walking, blurred vision, slurred speech, slowed reaction times, impaired memory, a risk of developing serious and persistent changes in the brain, as well as in the liver, because the liver is killed off by alcohol if there's no stopping of it for any length of time. Drug abuse, this is also about recreational drugs, not drugs that are recommended by your doctor. It erodes a person's self-esteem and their ability to make sound decisions, while sending intense impulses through the body to repeatedly take the drugs that their body needs. A stroke occurs when the blood supply to part of the brain is disrupted, causing brain cells to die. The causes of this can be a blockage in the artery. An embolic stroke is from an embolism, a clot. It's travelled around the body and ended up in the brain, blocking an artery. Or it could be due to a cerebral hemorrhage because of maybe an aneurysm. Cancer in the brain is often in the form of malignant tumour or brain cancer, and they're usually very invasive. And a central nervous system lymphoma invades the brain or the spinal cord. So they're the types of cancer that you might get in the nervous system. A transient ischemic attack is also known as a TIA, and the symptoms are very similar to a stroke, but they last less than 24 hours. The common cause is due to a tiny blood clot, and often they're called a mini stroke. However, unlike a stroke, the symptoms are transient and they go away. So a TIA is a mini stroke. Clinical depression is a type of depression that persists, and there's a lowered mood or loss of interest that lasts for at least 2 weeks. That would be considered clinical depression. There's a marked change from the behaviour of how somebody is behaving or functioning. Listlessness, lack of interest, feeling of hopelessness. It's very important that the first bout of clinical depression be treated really thoroughly, because the more bouts of depression you have, the more chronic the depression becomes. Bipolar affective disorder is a type of depression in which there are mood swings. So someone swings from being extremely high, happy and cheerful 1 minute to very low, debilitating mood the next. This is sometimes called manic depression. And actor Stephen Fry suffers from bipolar affective disorder, and so does Robbie Williams, I believe now. Postnatal depression is a depression that occurs after having a baby. It's very common in women, and 1 out of 10 women after they've had a baby will have postnatal depression. Seasonal affective disorder, also known as SAD, is a mood disorder. And there is thoughts that if you tell somebody they suffer from SAD, then they will be sad. And it's a sort of self-foreseeing prophecy. It's a mood disorder, and people who normally are fine get mental illness and mental health throughout the winter months of the year. It can be treated with an ultraviolet light or ultraviolet rays. A headache is a mild to severe pain in one or more parts of the head, as well as the back of the neck. Sometimes tension headaches can be felt at the back of the neck, and headaches above the eyes can often be sinus-related pain. Someone who suffers from migraine, nobody really knows what causes migraine, but it does affect people of all ages. It's a migraine is a throbbing, intense headache on one side of the head, sometimes associated with flashing lights and sort of visual disturbances. And people can often have to go to bed and pull the curtains and take some quite hefty medication to treat their migraine. Sciatica is pain shooting down the back of the leg into the heel. This is often caused by a deterioration or compression of the vertebral discs, but can also be caused by muscles that go into spasm, pressing on the sciatic nerve that runs down the lower back. Paralysis is complete loss of muscle function for one or more muscle groups for various reasons. It could be damage to the spinal cord. It's usually damage to a nerve of some sort. Alzheimer's disease is one of the most common forms of dementia. Apparently, if it's diagnosed really early, then you can have medication now to stop it in its tracks and not make it any worse. So if you do know somebody that you suspect has a form of dementia, don't just accept it. If it is Alzheimer's, then there is medication that can improve it. They also think now that sitting outside and getting vitamin D from the sun and eating walnuts for vitamin D can be very good for preventing dementia. Concussion is a disturbance of the function of the nerve cells, normally after a traumatic accident or injury. If you're playing something like rugby or football, quite often they can suffer from concussion. Boxers suffer from concussion, but usually concussion then would pass within a short period of time. So a disturbance of a function of nerve cells. Dementia is so common these days. It's a serious cognitive disorder
where people tend to remember things that happened in the past as though they were yesterday and really quite thoroughly, but something that happened this morning or something they did a couple of hours ago, they might not remember at all. Apparently, dancing is supposed to be very good for your coordination and your eye-hand coordination, your feet, and supposed to be very good for preventing dementia. And also, nutmeg is supposed to be, because it's shaped like a brain, nutmeg and vitamin D from walnuts are supposed to be very good for preventing dementia. Myasthenia gravis is a very rare condition affecting the nerves that supply the muscles around the body. But as I said, it's really rare, and in 35 years of being a therapist, I've not come anywhere near meeting anybody who's got myasthenia gravis. So a very rare condition.
Peripheral neuropathy is damage to the peripheral nerves in the peripheral nervous system. Poliomyelitis is a highly infectious viral disease which mainly affects the young and gives them quite a terrible disability of the legs in particular. Spinal cord injury is a myelopathy or damage to the white matter of the myelin fibre tracts down through the spinal cord. Meningitis is inflammation of the protection in the brain of those membranes that are covering the brain and the spinal cord, called the meninges. So it's inflammation of the meninges. It's often depicted by a rash initially, and it's highly contagious and affects young people in particular. Spina bifida is a developmental birth defect caused by the incomplete closure of the embryonic neural tube as a child is growing in the womb. I take, like you, with every system, to think about how stress affects the nervous system in this case. And obviously, when we become emotional, we have a nervous response which increases our heart rate and increases our breathing. We suffer from sleep disturbances, stomach problems, but also we produce a lot of noradrenaline and adrenaline, which kicks in our fear and our fight and flight syndrome. I'd also like you to think about how other systems affect the nervous system. And obviously we wouldn't have any muscular contractions if the nerve impulse wasn't sent to the muscle to contract it. The skeletal system wouldn't move without that nerve impulse to contract or relax the muscle, which then would affect the bone. The nerves control the rate of the heart, and so the blood pressure, the vasodilation as well. So the circulatory system is very reliant on the nervous system. The respiratory system, the nerves control the rate of respiration. The medulla oblongata controls the rate of respiration as well. The endocrine system is kept in check by the nervous system, and it's the nervous system that stimulates the production of some of the hormones in the body. This maintains the balance, and it's homeostasis, which is what we want to be balanced in the body. Homeostasis is the natural equilibrium of the body. The skin, the nerve endings are present at different levels in the skin.